Hey, what's up guys? I'm Sci-Hi, and today we're going to take a look at an Azorius or blue-white control kind of prison deck. But first, just a little bit of background. As a lot of you know, I've been rocking the green-white Enchantress style deck that also runs the Solemnity 9 lives prison combo a lot this latter season. And I still absolutely love that deck. I think it's extremely strong. It's a great choice for best of one to go all the way deep in the ladder in Mythic. However, that deck can kind of struggle against skilled players that are running a blue-white or Azorius control style deck, especially if it has the prison combo as well, because they can have so many counter spells. And as you know, if you've watched my previous video, my green-white flavor of Enchantress deck would use Approach of the Second Sun as an alternate win condition. And against blue control, and specifically, you're never going to resolve this spell against just so many counter spells, and they can pick you apart, and it can just become too difficult to overcome. It's not a unwinnable matchup, but nevertheless, so we're going to take a look at this Azorius prison deck today, and just dive right into the card choices. Some of these things may look a little odd, but I'll cover each thing in detail. So right off the bat, in the 2-drop slot, we still have our 1 copy of Rest in Peace as a great utility card to hose graveyard decks, specifically targeting Oven Cat combo, and Loss of Life can be really problematic for these prison decks because Loss of Life is not preventable by 9 lives. So Rest in Peace is just a great piece of tech to search up against graveyard decks. We've got 1 copy. We can search this up with another card that we'll get to shortly. This may look a little weird, but we've actually got 2 copies of Revitalize. You can kind of think of this as like the oil or the grease to get this deck rolling. We don't have a lot of 2-drop cards in this deck, so we've got to stay relevant and at least do something against aggro and stay alive, and also against other control decks. At worst, the life isn't going to be that relevant, but we're at least just cycling a card. And I guess before I go a little further, a little thought behind this deck. This is built to try to be as balanced as possible and have a good shot against a wide spectrum of decks that you're going to see in the ladder. For instance, combo, control, or aggro. So like anyone else, we could go ahead and build a deck that just absolutely annihilates aggro if we just stuffed this thing with 16 copies of Wrath of God effects, gain life, creature removal, authority of the consoles to make creatures come in to play tap for our opponent and gain life. We could totally stack our deck to be against aggro, and that might be a good thing if it's a heavy aggro meta. But we're trying to build this to have a good shot, be a solid deck to pilot and get used to and kind of master, so you can have fun and have a good shot against all different deck types. So that's kind of the theory behind this deck. So with that, that's why we have a card like Revitalize, which isn't awful against another control deck, because again, we're at least just cycling the card, getting a little bit of life, whether that may be relevant or not. Against control, most likely not, but against aggro will be, and we're just cycling a card to get to more cards in our deck. Moving on, in the 2-drop slot, we've got Dovin's Veto, just an awesome 2 casting cost counter spell that can't be countered. Of course, it doesn't hit creatures. It's got to be a non-creature spell, but that's totally fine in this deck because we've got a myriad of ways to deal with creatures and multiple sweepers, as we'll get to shortly. But so moving on, we get to maybe kind of a weird, unexpected looking card in Moon-Blessed Cleric, which is a 3-drop, 3/2 human elf cleric. And what this does, it's called Divine Intervention, for whatever that's worth. But when Moon-Blessed Cleric enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for any enchantment card, reveal it, shuffle, and put that card on top. So this is another search enchantment effect. You may be wondering, well, why are we using this instead of just the standard sorcery 3-mana search up an enchantment directly and put it in our hand? Well, that card can be very good if you already have 6 mana and you can search up maybe the last piece of your lock in Solemnity or 9 lives to get the prison online. But if you don't have 6 mana, you're not going to be able to search and drop that card that turn. This is where Moon-Blessed Cleric is kind of an interesting position card, because in the first critical turns, on turn 3 against aggro, if we drop this, we're at least getting a 3/2 body to chump block, and potentially could be the difference of the game in staying alive for the next turn to lock down the combo sooner rather than later. And another interesting thing about this is that when you're not putting the card in your hand, we're putting it on the top of our deck. That means our opponent can't use a Thoughtseize or something to strip away 9 lives or Solemnity that are so critical. So it's an interesting card for sure. It works surprisingly well. I know it looks a little weird, but it does fit a purpose in this deck. It does fill a role nicely. So moving on, of course, Solemnity and 9 lives, the familiar prison combo that you either love or hate. Now in this deck, unlike the Enchantress deck in one of my previous videos, we're not full on all in on the prison here, in that we're only running 1 copy of each. Now with the control deck, we've got much more tools at our disposal to counter spells, sweep the board, and just stay alive with powerful controlling effects. So we only have 1 copy of each of these because we can kind of just circumstantially eventually bump into these cards, run into them in our deck, and play them out and establish the lock. Whereas if we could go full on if it's a heavy aggro meta, like I was kind of alluding to earlier, but we're positioning this deck to be as good as possible against, again, a wide spectrum of decks. So with only 1 copy, we're not going to take a big cost hit to try to, we're not going to have 4 copies of each of this card against control, where the duplicates just don't become relevant and they're not doing anything for us and they become dead cards, and then we're going to lose a control matchup because we don't have enough counter magic, or we just have too many irrelevant cards. So that's why it's kind of a light prison lock in this deck. We're just going light on the prison here. So we've got 1 copy of each. And then moving on in the 3-drop slot, we've got 4 copies of Brazen Borrower. Now this performs, again, more duty against aggro and control. So it's a very flexible card in that on the second turn we can start casting Petty Theft, and maybe against elves we can bounce an elf, slow them down. Against other aggro decks, just stay alive. That's the name of the game here. We're just trying to mess up their game plan in the early phases so we can get to the late game and absolutely dominate with our powerful controlling cards. So also against control, it's awesome to have a flash creature that we can flash in, cast during their end step, pressure their planeswalkers like Narset, or if our opponent has Teferi or other planeswalkers and we need to pressure them, it's good to have kind of a mid-range threat so that we're not completely doing nothing for the early stages of the game, even against control, where a lot of times you're just saying draw, go, and passing the turn, and it's just a Cold War waiting for somebody to do something. There's not a big opportunity cost to cast something during their end step, and then we've got a threat, or we force them to possibly spend mana, use a counter spell, or have to deal with this on their own turn. So this card does a lot of things for this deck. We can bouncing anything is just a great kind of soft pseudo removal as well, and then to follow up with the Brazen Borrower as the actual threat that we can cast at flash instant speed. So great card all around. This card's proven itself in a wide array of formats already. So enough said about it. Moving on, we've got 4 copies of Archmage or Archmage's Charm. Just an absolute bomb of a card. It is 3 blue mana, but we can support it in this deck with our mana base, as we'll see shortly. But this card is incredibly flexible and powerful. Sees modern play. That's a good sign. It's good enough for historic as well. But so we can, with the Archmage's Charm, we can either counter a spell, draw 2 cards, or gain control of non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. This is an incredible ability against aggro or control. If our opponent is running control and they have Shark Typhoon and they're making massive sharks, We can take control of them with Archmage's Charm. We can counter spells to protect our 9-life Solemnity prison lock. And if the game is just kind of stale, not going anywhere, we can always draw 2 cards during our opponent's end step and just keep trying to build a card advantage against our opponent. So just a bomb of a card, extremely good. We've got 4 copies here as our premier counter spell in the deck. Moving on, we've got 1 copy of Wrath of God, and we may as well talk about all of the Wrath of God effects at this time. As you can see, we've got 4, 5, 6 total effects to sweep the board, and that may seem a little high, but we have to have at least 6, I believe, minimum, because there's just, elves, there's so many hyper aggressive aggro decks that still have the power to run us over, and even still can if we don't find Wrath of God on the 4th turn, and some sort of stalling effect in Revitalize or bouncing effects in Brazen Borrower. So we've got 6 Wrath of God sweeper effects. We're just trying to, we've got to be, we have to pay our respects to aggro, as, it's rampant in the format, and we do need these effects to just clear the board and reset. But we'll look at one of the more interesting sweepers that we have in Cleansing Nova, which is another versatile card. It is a simple Wrath of God effect in that we can destroy all creatures, but we can also choose to destroy all artifacts and enchantments. That may seem kind of weird, like why the hell would we want to do that if we're running 9 lives? We can kill ourselves in most instances. Well, certainly we don't want to do that. Most of the times you are going to be using this as a crappy 5-mana Wrath of God. However, having 1 copy of Cleansing Nova for this destroy all artifacts and enchantments effect is absolutely backbreaking and crushing against opposing prison combo decks. Even if you both have 9 lives, if you and your opponent both have 9 lives in play, I believe the ruling states that if you were to Cleansing Nova and kill all enchantments, it may seem counterintuitive and you would think that it'd be a draw, but actually the non-active player's triggers go on the stack and will resolve first. So that means that even if you and your opponent have 9 lives in play and you cast Cleansing Nova, they should be dead. Their 9 lives will trigger first and lose them the game before yours resolves, and you win. So it's a very powerful effect. Also, being able to destroy all artifacts can sometimes be relevant against these fringe affinity decks that are hyper fast and also floating around some of the historic ladder. So super cool card for sure. In our other Wrath, we've got, of course, the all-star Doomskar, which we can foretell for 2 mana, kind of a down payment to have a 3 mana Wrath of God, which is absolutely insane. So powerful, critical against elves for staying alive and other aggro decks. Just absolute MVP as far as I'm concerned in the sweeper slot. So great cards. We've got 4 copies of Doomskar. And then also in the 5 mana slot, we've got Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Ever heard of him? I mean, everybody knows this card it's maybe the best Planeswalker in Historic. This is going to fulfill your closing duty in this deck, as it does in most control decks. Oftentimes the best time to cast this will be after a sweeper, after you've stabilized. And this card on an empty board is hard for most decks to come back and win from. Once you get a few activations of its +1 ability, where you're drawing cards and untapping lands to enable more counter spells, you're going to quickly bury your opponent in card draw, and it's just going to be too much. But other things to be said about Teferi, also the -3 ability, extremely flexible and versatile and useful to be able to tuck, as it's called, to put any non-land permanent into its owner's library 3rd from the top. Oftentimes we may just have one difficult threat on the board that we need some spot removal, and Teferi will solve that problem and just get that card off the battlefield for us. Also, the tuck ability, it does come up sometimes. You get in strange situations where oftentimes in control mirror matches where you just get these absolute stalemate, disgusting, long, grinding games, and it may come down to somebody becoming decked. and just self-mill, they run out of cards. But Teferi could actually tuck himself back into your deck, and this happens more often than one might think. It's actually a pretty well-established, like, kind of course of action that happens in some of these long, drawn-out games where you tuck Teferi just back on top of your library, or a third from the top, depending on how many cards you actually have left in your library. And you do this just to prevent yourself from dying to self-mill, so you actually have a card to draw, and you don't lose the game that way. And then, of course, talk about its ultimate. Another kind of you win the game slowly ability. Once you've cracked this Teferi's ultimate, now every time you draw a card, you're going to be exiling your opponent's permanents, and you're going to quickly just make them disappear, and they're not going to have anything on the battlefield after this goes off several times. So again, just an amazing Planeswalker. It's a closer in this deck. We've got 3 copies. Certainly could argue for 4, but a lot of these choices are highly tweaked after a lot of gameplay, but of course always still tweaking and adjusting for as the meta evolves, as it always does. Lastly, we've got 4 Shark Typhoons, which most of the time this is going to be cycled at the end of turn if we're fishing or just trying to line up the combo or find more relevant spells. Or we've got a lot of mana, to sink at the end of our turn and use up. This can be great against other control decks as a way to get a threat on the board while still drawing a card. They can't counter the effect. At least with a traditional counter spell, they would have to counter the triggered ability of when you cycle the Shark Typhoon. We're getting a shark of, depending on whatever size, how much mana we pump into it. So just a good card against control and aggro as well to pop up surprise blockers. But specifically against control, we've got the full 4 copies of this to be able to cycle at their end step and get a threat on the board, so we can start pressuring them and make it so that our board state is better than theirs and force our opponent to act, so that we can kind of react and then try to play defense and counter what they're doing because we already have a threat on the board. Also, we can play this as just a regular enchantment. This won't come up too often because it's a heavy 6 mana investment to do this, especially against another control deck that kind of opens the window for us to get counterspelled, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So they could follow up with something better on their turn. So most of the time we're going to be cycling this, but it is worth noting that, again, this is an enchantment, so we can also go fetch that with Moon-Blessed Cleric when the time calls for it, and this is the card we need for certain situations. But we can look at the mana base now. We've got just a smattering of all the best white-blue dual lands in Historic. We've got even distribution of white versus white and blue, even though the deck is slightly tilted on white, but we do have a lot of dual casting cost things, or dual costing in double white, double blue, even triple blue. So we've got an even distribution and heavy on dual lands so that we don't get tied up on mana too bad when we're needing a specific color to cast some of these intensive blue spells like Archmage's Charm. So we've got, again, all of the best dual lands in Historic. We've got 1 Hall of Storm Giants as a creature land, and again, another closer, way to actually win the game if our opponent doesn't tap out from all the controlling prison effects. This can actually win the game. We've got 1 Castle Vantress. This is our mana sink, end of use it at our opponent's end step kind of land. Just to scry 2, do something with our mana, make sure we keep spending our mana and being an active player, and stacking our deck and finding relevant spells. So just a great card, already proven itself in Historic and wide array of decks. So not much more to say about it. And we've got on the white flavor of things, we've talked about blues Hall of Storm Giants, but with white we've got Cave of the Frost Dragon, which is just another creature land, this one with flying, so it can be relevant sometimes if we need to fly over blockers and get a win that way. And then, of course, we got a Castle Ardenvale, the white castle, to make 1/1 humans again at our opponent's end step, and kind of a mana sink utility land here. But so that's the deck. That's what got rolling with now. I'll probably get gameplay videos up of these different prison style decks before too long. But let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, comment. I'm really curious to what you guys think is the best flavor of these prison Solemnity 9 Lives decks. I think there's a lot of different things to explore yet. Again, I think the Enchantress version, the green-white, is absolutely awesome, and I think getting close to perfecting the best 60 cards for that archetype. I'm still really exploring the best way to do an Azorius or white-blue version. But check out, stay tuned for future videos. I'm going to actually look at a white-black Orzhov prison combo deck that's pretty spicy, a lot more proactive, much more different style of play if that's your thing. I'm not a big control player myself, so looking forward to talking about that. But let me know what you think in comments. What is the best prison combo deck? Where are these two cards? Where is their best home? I think that 9 Lives and Solemnity they're too strong to ignore. This is such a powerful combo and historic. I mean, I know obviously there's ways around it with Loss of Life and Stomp, Questing Beast, cards that can make it so damage can't be prevented. So it's not like it's not like you're invincible or anything, but damn near close against a lot of aggro decks. So this combo is too powerful to ignore, and it sure feels great to just drop a couple cards and have our opponent concede. But I'm still just really exploring, trying to find the best home for this. Maybe it's Orzhov, maybe it's Azorius, maybe it's in the green-white Enchantress, or maybe it's something totally different that none of us have even really explored or discovered. Maybe it's a Boros or a white-red version I could see with some Chandras. But anyways, my mind's running wild. You know, the creative side of your brain can often spiral out of control, and that it's time for maybe the more objective, rational side of your brain to stop theorizing and just put a deck together, take it on the ladder, and see if it actually has legs, or maybe it's just some insane pipe dream in your head and it actually sucks. So, but again, these two cards are too interesting to not build around. So I want to hear what you guys think. Again, please like, subscribe for more strategy comments, all that yada yada yada. It helps us out, helps grow the channel. We got a lot more upgrades planned for this. So let me know what you guys think, and good luck on the ladder. Peace.